Get full episodes of The Damage Report as a podcast on iTunes and Android, and you can watch the live show every weekday on YouTube TV. So can Beto O'Rourke actually make it happen in Texas? We are joined on The Damage Report now by John Nichols, political writer and author, to help break it down. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you, brother.
Good to have you here. So we'll return to Beto in just 1 second, but I also just want to ask you one question about your recently released book, Trumpocalypse. What's that about?
Well, right off the bat, you got the name right. That's impressive. A lot of people have struggled with pronunciation. It's a study of the members of Trump's inner circle, particularly his cabinet appointees and people he's appointed to oversight positions. And what it does is break them down as regards their politics, their connections to economic and political forces. And it's really a handbook. And we've had a good ride with it, in part because Trump has appointed people to incredibly powerful positions who tend to be very unnoted. We know his inner circle, we know Trump himself, but we're not always aware of who he's put into positions that are staggeringly influential. And I keep thinking of people like Rick Perry over at Energy. We ought to be talking about that every day.
And Scott Pruitt obviously generated quite a few headlines, but others probably deserve just as many, as you say,
You're
like
right.
Rick Perry.
You're right.
So let's turn now to the Senate race. You have Beto O'Rourke, you have Ted Cruz. You've been following this very closely. What is Beto O'Rourke doing differently than past Senate Democrats trying to win in Texas have done?
He's being interesting. He's actually being worth paying attention to the extent that we're actually talking about it. That's very different. Remember, Texas Democrats haven't won a US Senate race since 1988 with Lloyd Bentsen. And so they've been on a losing streak for a very long time. And what O'Rourke has done from the start is say that he's not going to repeat the old mistakes. He's not going to run like Republican or like Democrats have run in the last many cycles, which is toward the center, not saying much, struggling to kind of keep up with the Republican fundraising machine. What he's done is run a bold campaign, taking strong stands on a host of issues. He hasn't, you don't have to agree with him on everything, but he's been quite notably outspoken, and he has literally gone to every corner of the state. He has set up a campaign like none I have seen in Texas. I was there yesterday. And I was in a neighborhood in his hometown, El Paso, but far from the center of action, far from downtown. And every neighborhood there are pop-up offices, literally like a store or a restaurant or someplace else that's backing the guy, where they have a Beto pop-up office sign out front. And so there's just this incredible grassroots thing going on. It's notable. It's still an uphill race. Nobody should lie about that. But if something can be done, I happen to believe this is the kind of campaign that would do it.
So as you say, he's campaigning a slightly different way, trying to get possibly some people who felt like there was no real inroads for them, like in terms of candidates to support in Texas for quite a while. In terms of the actual evidence we have, data about early voting and voter registration, are there reasons to believe that this electoral strategy is actually working and that his current lag in the polls, he's down, depending on which one you look at, like 5, 6, 7 points, that might not actually reflect what's likely to happen on election day?
I think we have to bet on that. First off, the early voting is epic. The lines outside of polling places were extremely large as early voting began. And notably, there were people who literally slept out overnight. Wow. And you tell me whether you think Ted Cruz supporters are the ones sleeping out overnight. I don't happen to buy that. I think these tend to be younger folks. In some places, the early voting lines have been almost like parties, like celebrations. And now, don't underestimate that there is a lot of early voting for the Republicans as well. Texas has a very strong Republican organization. What's notable here is that the Democrats are turning out. And so you have evidence that something real is happening there. And I'll point to two other things that are worth noting at this critical stage in the early voting. Texas daily newspapers make their endorsements as the early voting begins. And so that's where you get a kind of feel for if there's going to be some sort of last minute, burst of support, unexpected level of support. The three daily newspapers in the largest cities in Texas, the three largest cities, in recent days have all endorsed Beto O'Rourke against Ted Cruz, and they've been scathing on Ted Cruz. That's uncommon. That's something that speaks to your suburban voters. It speaks to maybe even some of your swing voters. It also helps with mobilization. Second thing I think is very worth noting, if you look at the last four polls in Texas, fourth back, O'Rourke was down by 9 points. Next poll, he's down by 8 points. Next poll, he's down by 7 points. Next poll just came out today, he's down by 6 points. There seems to be evidence that he is moving up, closing that gap in the final stages. I'm not telling you he can do it. That's something that the voters will decide on through now to November 6th. But what I am telling you is that people at the national level who write this race off, the naysayers who say something like this couldn't happen in Texas, are not paying attention to what is happening in Texas right now.
So I also want to talk to you about Ted Cruz because back in his last election, he won by I think something like 16 points. He was as you might expect in Texas, but he was certainly popular. Have views of Ted Cruz in Texas changed at all in the intervening years?
I think so. Look, nobody ever really loved the guy. I think that's a fair thing to say. Even in the Republican Party, there has tended to be a discomfort with him. He's a very edgy player. He's always seemed to be more in it for himself necessarily than even for the party. And so there's always been a slight discomfort level. But his presidential run seemed to reinforce some of the worst impressions of the guy. And one of the things that O'Rourke has done in his campaign is really emphasize the fact of that presidential run, the fact that Cruz took off almost immediately after getting elected to the Senate to start, building out for a national political play. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that O'Rourke talks about a lot is the fact that O'Rourke has been to every county in Texas, whereas Cruz has been to every county in Iowa.
Yeah. I have heard that in basically every speech he's given, actually.
Every speech he's given, and the debates.
Exactly. So you've got Beto O'Rourke, you've got Ted Cruz, but I think obviously we should acknowledge there's a third figure that's very important in this race, as in all races across the country, and that would be Donald Trump. I think both are very eager to talk about Trump these days. Donald Trump, who do you think he's helping more in the Senate race?
Yeah, I think he probably helps both of them, and that's possible in politics. Trump helps to mobilize some of the Republican base, which might not really like Ted Cruz very much, but they may have an affection for Trump, or they may simply not want to lose unitary power out in Washington. He also clearly helps O'Rourke because there's a lot of people who, Texas is a state with a lot of incoming. There's a lot of people who move there to get jobs. There are folks who may not be necessarily deeply focused on Texas politics, but they are potential voters. When you can nationalize a race and talk about Donald Trump and talk about being able to send a signal as regards Donald Trump, particularly a signal on behalf of a young, relatively progressive candidate, that has appeal from a mobilization standpoint. So I do think Trump plays both ways. And there's one final element here that's super interesting. There are groups on the ground, and in fact, buying billboards, doing television, putting up Donald Trump's quotes about Ted Cruz from the 2016 campaign. Yeah. And so there's a lot of sort of cognitive dissonance coming out of Trump's mouth, depending on whether you're listening to him in 2016 or 2018.
Yeah, I heard that Ted Cruz has gone from Lion Ted to Beautiful Ted. Donald Trump has said that.
Yeah. No, you tell me too. I don't know whether beautiful is quite the term generally used as regards Ted Cruz, and I'm also not totally sure how helpful it is in Texas, but that is where Trump has gone with this.
Yeah, that is a slightly odd one. Well, John Nichols, thank you for joining us on the show. Political writer, also author of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse. We appreciate your contribution.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.